She slapped my hand for moving her purse off a chair. My son looked away, like I was the embarrassment. By morning her name was erased. From the trust, the deed, and every account she flaunted. I'd spent decades building this family's foundation. She thought marrying my son made her the queen. She forgot who still holds the crown. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The sting wasn't from Amber's palm, but from the audacity of it, the sharp crack of skin against skin in the middle of a white tablecloth restaurant. For a moment, 74-year-old Patricia Callahan wasn't a widowed accountant with decades of poise. She was a scolded child, frozen mid-motion, hands suspended in the air above a quilted leather purse perched arrogantly on the only open chair at the table. "Don't touch my things," Amber snapped, her eyes sharp, glossy with heavy mascara that had no business in daylight. The restaurant hushed around them. Silverware stopped clinking, conversations fizzled into awkward silence, and wine glasses hovered mid-air. Even the ceiling fans above the Charleston Harbor windows seemed to hesitate. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, coughing into his napkin. "Let's just sit, Mom," he muttered, gaze fixed firmly on the tablecloth. Pat lowered her hand with the measured grace of someone refusing to grant her daughter-in-law a scene. But beneath her calm surface, fury hummed in her veins, steady and hot. She moved to the opposite chair, spreading her linen napkin across her lap like a curtain closing on Act 1. The young waiter approached as if stepping into a storm. "Would you like to hear today's specials?" he asked, voice thin and tentative. "Yes," Pat replied coolly, fixing her gaze on him, never once glancing toward Amber. Amber leaned back in her chair, tossing her highlighted hair as though she were victorious. She ordered champagne, her tone dripping with entitlement, while Daniel followed with a bourbon neat, his jaw tight. Pat stayed with water, though her mind sharpened like glass. She listened politely, but each shallow word Amber spoke only fueled Pat's quiet accounting, cataloging the purse, the slap, the silence of her son, and the arrogance that had finally tipped too far. Amber filled the air with chatter, her spa appointments, her weekend shopping trip, a boring charity auction. Daniel made non-committal noises, eyes fixed on his plate. At 45, he still looked like a boy avoiding conflict at the dinner table. When Pat's grilled grouper arrived, steaming and fragrant with lemon zest and butter, she cut into it with meticulous precision. Each bite was a practice in restraint, every slice an anchor to civility. Outwardly, she smiled and nodded when spoken to, but inwardly, her thoughts turned cold and deliberate. She was calculating now. By dessert, her appetite had long vanished. "None for me," she said crisply, folding her napkin. Amber turned to Daniel with a saccharine smile. "We should stop at King Street after this. There's a pair of shoes I saw last week." Daniel nodded quickly, seizing the safety of small talk. Pat placed her card on the tray before the waiter could ask. If Amber wanted to flaunt her purse, Pat would remind her who actually carried the means. "Mom, you don't have to," Daniel began. "I insist," Pat said, finality in her tone. When the check disappeared, so did Pat's patience. She stood, her chair scraping across the polished hardwood, with a deliberate edge. Heads turned at nearby tables, eyes following her, though she ignored them all. As she walked toward the entrance, her heels tapped against the floor, steady and unhurried. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the kitchen door swing open. Chef Ron Simmons, flour-dusted and broad-shouldered, leaned against the threshold, drying his hands on his apron. His gaze wasn't on Amber or Daniel. It was fixed on Pat. His words carried low but clear, like a secret slipping through the din of the restaurant. "You still control the family trust, right?" Pat's stride faltered for the briefest second. The slap had stung, but those words ignited something far deeper. The next morning, Charleston streets carried the scent of salt from the harbor, mingled with magnolia blossoms drifting in the summer air. Patricia Callahan walked with purpose, heels steady against the cobblestones, her linen jacket buttoned despite the humidity. The sting of Amber's slap lingered not on her skin, but in her memory. It wasn't pain, it was a ledger entry, marked in red, waiting to be balanced. The glass doors of Coastal Federal Bank gleamed in the morning light. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly lemon polish and money, an aroma Pat had known all her professional life. A receptionist greeted her with practiced cheer, but she waved it aside. She was expected. At the far end of the hallway, Harold Mitchell stood in his office doorway, sleeves rolled, tie slightly loosened, as though he had already been buried in numbers for hours. His face softened when he saw her. "Patricia," he said warmly, gesturing her inside. "I was hoping you'd stop by." "Coffee? Black, no sugar," she replied, sliding into the leather chair opposite his desk. Her tone carried the weight of someone not here for pleasantries. He poured the coffee from a carafe, set the cup in front of her, and leaned back. "What's on your mind?" Pat set her bag neatly on the floor, smoothing her skirt. "The Callahan Family Trust. I want to review the current holdings, line by line." Harold's brows lifted slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. "Of course." He turned to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard, the glow of the monitor reflecting off his glasses. Within seconds, numbers filled the screen, columns of assets, distributions and clauses. Pat knew as well as her own name. He swiveled the monitor slightly in her direction. "Here we are. You're listed as trustee, with full discretion. Daniel and Amber are beneficiaries, as designated by the original documents. No changes since last quarter." Pat's eyes narrowed, tracing each entry. The figures stood tall and orderly. Real estate proceeds, investment dividends, liquid accounts. She took a sip of coffee, its bitterness grounding her. "So to be clear," she said, voice calm but deliberate, "I control every distribution. Nothing leaves this trust without my signature." "That's correct," Harold confirmed. His tone carried reassurance, but also curiosity. He studied her over the rim of his glasses. "Did something happen?" Pat exhaled slowly, setting her cup down with precision. "Let's just say I was reminded yesterday that some people mistake access for ownership." A flicker of understanding passed across Harold's face. He didn't press. Instead, he adjusted his tie and returned his gaze to the screen. "Well, to answer the question unspoken, yes, you have full control. The trust is ironclad in your favor until you choose otherwise." Pat leaned back in her chair, the cool leather creaking softly beneath her. For the first time since yesterday's humiliation, her shoulders eased. She let the numbers sit before her, like soldiers ready to be commanded. Assets meant choices. Choices meant leverage, and leverage in her hands had always been used with precision. For a moment the office was silent but for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional click of Harold's mouse. Outside, muffled footsteps echoed through the bank's marble hallways, but inside, the world was narrowed to two people and a screen full of figures. Pat tapped a manicured finger against the armrest. "If I wanted to reconsider the distribution term, you could," Harold said smoothly. "As trustee, you can redirect funds, amend allocations, provided it remains within the legal framework of the trust deed." He paused. "If you're thinking about it seriously, you'd want your attorney to draft the paperwork." Pat's lips curved into something between a smile and a smirk. Amber thought a purse was power, but here was the real purse. One that held futures, not lipstick. Harold studied her for a moment, as though gauging just how far she intended to go. His voice lowered slightly, carrying weight. "Patricia," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "do you want me to set up a meeting with your attorney?" Patricia Callahan's fingers hovered over the keypad of her phone, the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in her Charleston townhouse filling the space behind her. The slap at the restaurant, the purse, the humiliation, it all lingered like a bruise no one else could see. But tonight, in her high-ceilinged parlor, with the soft hum of cicadas outside the shuttered windows, she wasn't thinking about Amber's temper. She was thinking about strategy. She dialed Laura Jennings. The familiar receptionist's voice answered, light and efficient. Jennings and Associates, how may I direct your call? This is Patricia Callahan. I need to schedule a meeting with Laura at the earliest available time. Pat's tone was calm, clipped, the same one she'd once used when speaking to IRS auditors. The receptionist tapped away. Understood. Let me check the calendar. It may be a few days, Pat interrupted gently. Tell her it concerns the Callahan Family Trust. There was a pause. The kind of pause that said the receptionist knew this wasn't routine. I'll mark it urgent, she promised. After hanging up, Pat moved to her mahogany desk, where neat stacks of folders waited. She pulled out the Callahan Family Trust binder, flipping it open with practiced precision. Statements, amendments, distribution schedules, all lined up like soldiers on parade. She set them in a briefcase, each page slotted into place. Her phone buzzed. Daniel's name glowed across the screen. She let it ring once before answering. Hey, Mom, his voice said, casual, distracted. In the background, faint music and the hum of traffic bled through. Amber and I are heading out for a little weekend getaway. Thought I'd let you know in case you needed us. Pat closed her eyes briefly. The timing perfect in its irony. He was off to play house while his wife plotted her next shopping spree. Enjoy yourselves, she said evenly. Be safe. He paused, maybe waiting for more, but she didn't offer it. With a sigh, he hung up. The phone dinged again, this time an email. Harold Mitchell. She opened it to find a scanned copy of the trust deed attached, the subject line crisp as requested. Pat downloaded it and printed the document, the warm paper sliding into the tray as the printer hummed in the quiet room. She carried it to the dining table, spreading the pages out under the glow of the chandelier. For hours she traced each clause with her fingertip. The language was dense, legal, protective, but she knew how to read it. Trustee discretion, sole authority, revocable upon amendment. Each phrase was a door, and she was the only one with the key. Outside, the Charleston night deepened. Carriage wheels clattered faintly on the cobblestones beyond her window. The air smelled faintly, buff mud drifting in from the harbor, mingling with the lavender sachet she kept in the drawer. Pat worked through it all, her pen marking notes in the margins. At 10 o'clock, she paused long enough to heat a kettle and pour herself a cup of chamomile tea. The steam fogged her glasses, and she removed them, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Her body was tired, but her mind felt sharper than it had in months. She gathered the papers back into the binder, closing it with a decisive snap. One move had already been made. The slap at the restaurant. Now it was her turn to answer. The phone rang again, slicing through the quiet. She picked it up. Mrs. Callahan? A woman's voice, brisk and professional. Yes, this is Laura's assistant. She can see you first thing tomorrow. Pat's lips curved faintly. Checkmate wasn't here yet, but the board was shifting. Morning light spilled across Broad Street, striking the pastel facades of Charleston's historic buildings. Patricia Callahan walked up the steps of Laura Jennings' law office, the soles of her shoes clicking firmly against the old stone. The brass handle was cool against her palm as she pulled the door open, stepping into an airy lobby that smelled faintly with lemon polish and old paper. Laura Jennings was waiting. At 66, the estate attorney carried herself with a quiet assurance, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, her tailored suit pressed sharp. She rose from behind her desk, hand extended. Patricia, it's been too long. Not long enough, Pat replied dryly, shaking her hand. They sat across from one another at a mahogany desk, where stacks of files leaned like miniature city skylines. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the air. Laura folded her hands, leaning slightly forward. Tell me what brought you here today. Pat's lips pressed thin, her voice measured. Amber. At lunch yesterday she slapped my hand because I dared move her purse off a chair. Laura blinked once, her expression carefully neutral, though the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth betrayed distaste. I see. She did it in public, Pat continued, her tone flat but edged with steel. Daniel sat there, silent. The whole restaurant went quiet, and I thought, if she feels bold enough to strike me in front of strangers, what does she feel entitled to when no one's watching? Laura didn't interrupt. She simply nodded, letting Pat's words sink into the quiet air of the office. Pat reached into her briefcase and slid the trust binder across the desk. I want it changed, now. Laura adjusted her glasses and opened the folder, scanning the clauses with practiced ease. Her fingertip traced the lines of text as she murmured, half to herself, half to Pat. Trustee discretion intact, irrevocable, only in certain conditions. Ah, here. Yes. You have sole authority to amend. Pat folded her hands in her lap, the faint scent of her lavender hand cream drifting upward. Her breathing was steady, but her eyes were sharp. Let's be specific, Laura said, pulling a fresh legal pad from her drawer. What outcome are you seeking? I want Amber removed, completely. Not 1 cent should reach her. Laura's pen scratched across the page. And Daniel? Pat's gaze softened briefly, though only for a moment. Daniel is my son. He'll have his portion. But it needs to be protected from her reach. Redirect it, she paused, calculating, to something she cannot touch. A college scholarship fund. The Callahan name should outlast this nonsense. Laura's brows rose slightly, impressed. A philanthropic pivot, that carries weight. Pat's tone was unflinching. It carries control. For the next hour, the room filled with the rhythm of pens on paper, the occasional creak of leather chairs, and the faint hum of traffic outside. Laura read clauses aloud, clarifying implications, while Pat listened with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in numbers. They discussed tax shelters, stipulations, contingencies, every detail locked into place like the teeth of a gear. Finally, Laura slid a fresh set of pages across the desk, the ink still smelling faintly metallic. Here it is. Amendment prepared. Amber Callahan is hereby excluded as a beneficiary. Daniel Callahan's allocation is redirected to the Callahan Scholars Fund, to be managed at your discretion. Pat took the fountain pen Laura offered. Her hand didn't tremble. She signed her name in bold strokes, the ink blooming black against the creamy paper. When she set the pen down, there was no triumph in her face, only resolve. A line had been crossed at that restaurant. Now, another had been drawn here. Laura gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, her expression unreadable, but her tone certain. I'll file these immediately. By tomorrow the amendment will be fully executed. She met Pat's eyes, her voice dropping slightly, and I'll have Harold move the funds tomorrow. The following morning, the air in Charleston was thick with August heat, even at 9 o'clock. Patricia Callahan sat in her parlor, ceiling fan humming above, lace curtains stirring faintly from the harbor breeze. The antique phone on the side table rang, its sharp trill slicing through the quiet. Patricia, came Harold Mitchell's steady voice. It's done. The funds have been reallocated as per Laura's amendment. The Callahan Scholars Fund is officially active, and Amber is no longer listed as a beneficiary. Pat's fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. She allowed herself one small nod, though Harold couldn't see it. Send me a certified statement for my records, Harold. Paper copies. Not just email. Already ordered, he replied. You'll have them by courier this afternoon. Good. Pat's tone was calm, but the satisfaction in her chest was sharp, electric. She set the phone back in its cradle and reached for her tea. Before she could take a sip, her cell phone buzzed across the table, its screen lighting up with Amber's name. Pat let it ring twice before answering. Why is my access frozen? Amber's voice cracked like glass, sharp and shrill. The joint account with Daniel. Why can't I move anything? Why are my transfers bouncing? Pat leaned back in her chair, her voice smooth as cream. You'll have to ask your trustee. There was a stunned pause. Then a hissed, you, but Pat had already ended the call. The silence that followed was sweeter than any dessert she'd skipped at that restaurant. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Daniel. We need to talk. Just 4 words. No hello, no explanation, no warmth. Pat placed the phone face down on the table, and turned her attention to the harbor outside her window. A schooner's sails caught the sun, glinting white against the blue. She thought of Daniel as a boy, sailing with his father, laughter ringing over the water. That boy had grown into a man who no longer steered his own ship. She rose and moved through the townhouse, her heels tapping softly on the hardwood. In the kitchen she placed a fresh lemon pie on the counter, a neighbor's gift, and cut herself a small slice. The tang of citrus hit her tongue, bright and grounding. She would need her composure for the storm to come. By mid-afternoon, the courier arrived. Pat opened the thick envelope and slid out the documents. The embossed bank seal gleamed at the bottom of each page. She ran her fingers lightly across the raised lettering, the way one might touch proof of something long awaited. Amber was gone from the ledger, erased in black ink and finality. Pat carried the papers upstairs, locking them in the fireproof safe hidden behind her wardrobe. She had lived long enough to know victory required protection. She had just closed the safe when the landline rang again. Mrs. Callahan. Harold's voice tighter than usual. I thought you should know something right away. Pat frowned. What is it? There was the faint shuffle of papers on his end. Amber came in not an hour ago. She tried to open a new account under your name. She had falsified paperwork, driver's license, social security number, even a signature sample. The attempt was blocked immediately. But, he hesitated. It was brazen. Pat froze, one hand braced against the edge of her dresser. The audacity of a slap at lunch had now become the audacity of forgery at a bank. Her eyes narrowed, her voice low and deliberate. You're telling me she tried to become me? Harold exhaled. That's exactly what I'm telling you. The room around Pat seemed to still, as though the air itself waited for her next move. Patricia Callahan stepped into Coastal Federal Bank with the precision of a soldier reporting for duty. The lobby buzzed with the low murmur of clients and the faint whir of printers, but her presence carved its own silence. She wore a navy linen suit, despite the summer heat, her silver hair pinned immaculately. This wasn't just a visit. This was a declaration. Harold Mitchell was waiting near his office door, his expression tighter than usual. He ushered her inside quickly, closing the door behind them. The blinds rattled softly in the air-conditioned draft, muting the world beyond. Patricia, he said, lowering his voice, we've already flagged the attempt. Nothing got through. Pat sat smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm. And the forgery? Harold tapped the folder on his desk. We've filed it under attempted identity fraud. Security footage, signature discrepancies. It's airtight. Still, I'll need your signature on a fraud prevention notice. It'll lock down all accounts in your name, making it impossible for her to try again. Pat reached for the pen. Her hand didn't waver as she signed, the scratch of ink loud in the quiet office. She slid the paper back to Harold, her eyes narrowing. Erase her, completely. No loopholes. You already did, Harold said gently. But this makes it unshakable. Pat nodded once, then rose. Business was done. As she stepped out into the humid Charleston air, her phone vibrated. A voicemail alert. She lifted it to her ear. Amber's voice burst through, ragged and venomous. You're ruining my life, Patricia. Do you understand that? Everything I've worked for, everything Daniel and I built, you've just stolen it. You're a bitter old woman, and you'll die bitter and alone. I hope you choke on your inheritance, because you won't take mine. Pat slipped the phone back into her bag, her expression unchanged. But inside, her fury calcified into something colder than anger, resolve. Later that afternoon, another message came. Daniel's this time. Mom, can we meet? Just coffee. Please, I need to understand what's happening. Pat studied the words on the screen. Daniel's tone was softer than Amber's, less venom, more bewilderment. He was still his father's son, too gentle for the war Amber had dragged him into. She typed back 2 words, Harbor Cafe. The next morning, the cafe smelled of roasted beans and sea salt drifting in from the marina. Its walls were lined with photographs of sailboats, fishermen and pelicans, a place that had always felt neutral ground. Pat chose a corner table where she could see the entrance and the water beyond. She had barely settled her cup on the saucer when her phone buzzed again. An email from Laura Jennings. All legal changes finalized. The Callahan Scholars Fund is now fully active and protected under the amended trust deed. Congratulations. Pat allowed herself the smallest smile. Everything was in order now. Every safeguard, every lock, every door Amber had once thought open was sealed tight. Then Daniel walked in. He looked older than his 45 years. His shirt rumpled, his eyes rimmed red as though sleep had been scarce. He spotted her and approached slowly, shoulders hunched. "Mom," he said, sliding into the chair opposite her. His coffee order was simple, black, no sugar, like hers. When it arrived, he wrapped both hands around the cup as though it might steady him. For a moment, neither spoke. The clatter of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the faint seagull cries outside, filled the silence between them. Finally, Daniel's voice cracked it. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel's question hung between them, heavier than the steam rising from his untouched coffee. His hands tightened around the mug, knuckles pale, as though gripping it might hold his mother in place. Across the table, Pat stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking against porcelain with a rhythm that was deliberate, unhurried. "Why am I doing this?" she repeated softly, eyes steady on him. "Because the trust is my responsibility, not yours. Certainly not Amber's. It was built by your father and me, brick by brick, penny by penny. It isn't a toy to be snatched because she likes new shoes." Daniel winced at the edge in her voice. She just has a strong personality, Mom. She can come off harsh, but she doesn't mean." Pat's laugh cut him short. It wasn't cruel, but it was sharp, brittle as glass. A strong personality does not excuse public humiliation. It does not excuse forgery. Respect isn't optional, Daniel. Not in a marriage, not in a family, not in a trust. Daniel shifted, his chair scraping slightly on the tile floor. Around them the cafe buzzed with quiet conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scent of baked cinnamon rolls drifting from the counter. Yet in their corner it felt like a courtroom. Every word heavy, every sign louder than it should be. "Do you even hear yourself?" Daniel's voice was low, almost pleading. "You're treating her like some kind of criminal. She's my wife." Pat leaned forward, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Then she should act like one. Instead, she treats your marriage like a bank vault with a broken lock." His mouth opened, then closed. He stared down at his coffee, stirring it though he hadn't added sugar. "You've always been hard," he muttered. "I've always been fair," Pat corrected. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the faint clink of Daniel's spoon and the seagulls crying outside, carried in through the open door. Pat's phone buzzed on the table, slicing through the tension. The name Harold Memel-Chell glowed across the screen. Without hesitation, she picked it up. "Harold," she said, her tone even. Daniel exhaled in frustration, running a hand over his face, but he didn't interrupt. On the other end, Harold's voice carried a new edge. Sharper than usual. "Patricia, you should see this withdrawal. Amber just tried to make." Pat's eyes flickered, but her voice stayed calm. "Tell me everything." Daniel froze across the table, his frustration shifting into something else: worry, confusion, maybe fear. The silence between them deepened again, the weight of Harold's words pressing down like a storm about to break. Harold's voice hummed through the phone, low and deliberate. "It wasn't the trust this time," he said. "She went after Daniel's personal account, tried to withdraw 5,000. The teller flagged it. Signature didn't match. We stopped it cold." Pat sat straighter in her cafe chair, her tea cooling beside her. Across from her, Daniel leaned forward, eyebrows drawn tight. Though Harold couldn't see him, Pat knew her son was hanging on every word. "Flag it," Pat instructed. Her voice was sharp, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Mark the account with a security alert. Require Daniel's in-person authorization for any withdrawals. No exceptions." "Already done," Harold confirmed, but he deserves to know directly. Pat's eyes flicked to Daniel, whose expression had gone pale, his lips pressed in a thin line. "He'll hear it," she said. "Don't worry about that." After the call ended, Daniel's voice cracked the silence. She tried to take from my account?" Pat didn't soften her tone. "Yes, and she would have succeeded if the teller hadn't caught it." Daniel pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching against tile. He stood pacing toward the cafe window, running a hand through his hair. Outside, the marina glimmered in the sunlight, boats rocking gently, a scene too calm for the storm building inside him. "She can't." He stopped, shaking his head. "This isn't who she is." Pat remained seated, calm in the storm. "It is exactly who she is, Daniel. And I won't protect either of you from her recklessness anymore." He turned, his eyes full of a wounded kind of disbelief. "You act like you're protecting me, but all you're doing is cutting her out. Cutting us out." Pat rose slowly, gathering her purse. Her heels clicked once against the tile floor as she moved past him. "If you can't see the difference, then you're blinder than I thought." She left him there, staring at the boats he once loved, the son who had learned nothing from his father's discipline. That evening, Pat returned to her townhouse. The air inside was cool, scented faintly of lemon oil, from the furniture polish her housekeeper used earlier in the week. On her desk sat an email alert. She opened it. Laura Jennings had sent over the finalized trust statements. PDFs were attached, each page stamped and sealed, each line confirming Amber's erasure. Pat printed them carefully, the warm paper sliding into her hands. She placed them into a leather folio, then carried them upstairs. The safe behind her wardrobe door opened with a familiar click. Inside, rows of neatly organized folders gleamed in the dim light. Pat slid the folio into its slot, closed the door, and spun the dial. The metal clank echoed in the room, final and satisfying. Amber's hands would never reach here. Pat exhaled, a long, slow breath. For the first time in days, her shoulders loosened. The trust was sealed. The accounts were guarded. Every move had been anticipated, every loophole shut. Then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, expecting another email from Laura or Harold. Instead, the glow of the screen showed a notification from social media. Amber Callahan, public post. Pat tapped the screen. "Being robbed by your own family. Imagine thinking you're secure, and then one bitter old woman takes everything you built. I guess blood means nothing when greed is stronger." The words burned, framed by comments already flooding in. Sympathetic emojis, gasps, questions, Amber's friends piling on, calling it unfair, tragic, cruel. Pat's lips tightened. She set the phone down on the desk with deliberate care. Amber had finally gone public. By the next morning, Amber's online post had bloomed like algae across stagnant water. Sympathy comments stacked beneath it. "So unfair. Can't believe family would do this. Stay strong, girl." Heart emojis, angry faces, hashtags. Amber was spinning the wheel of pity, and her friends were clapping like an audience at a cheap matinee. Pat scrolled through the thread once, her lips pursed in something between irritation and amusement. She didn't comment. She didn't defend. She simply closed the app, set the phone on her polished mahogany desk, and picked up her book club novel instead. The words on the page, "Faulkner this month," carried more weight than anything Amber could type in a tantrum. That afternoon, the parlor filled with the warm scent of brewed coffee and lemon cookies as her book club gathered. 6 women, all in their 60s and 70s, chatted about chapters and metaphors, about characters too stubborn to change. Pat listened, contributed thoughtfully, and let the hum of friendship drown out any lingering echoes of Amber's shrill online accusations. For 2 hours, laughter bubbled between china cups, the sound a shield against pettiness. Her phone buzzed again after everyone left. A text from Harold. "For your files." Attached were screenshots of Amber's posts, comments, shares. He had highlighted certain lines, timestamps, usernames. every thread catalogued like evidence in a trial. Pat smiled faintly. Harold wasn't just her banker. He was her silent sentry, guarding the fortress from within. Minutes later, Laura Jennings' name appeared on her caller ID. Pat answered, her voice even. Patricia, Laura said, her tone brisk but reassuring. I've reviewed everything. Amber can rant all she wants online. The trust amendment is airtight. She has no legal ground. None. Don't waste a thought worrying. Good, Pat replied. She didn't waste words. The comfort wasn't in Laura's assurance, it was in knowing Laura would say the same thing under oath if pressed. When the call ended, the townhouse fell quiet again. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor. Inside, the only sound was the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Daniel didn't call. He didn't text. Not that night. Not the following day. Not even the one after. Silence stretched across their relationship like the span of the Ravenel Bridge, long, heavy, suspended. Pat let it stand. She spent her mornings walking along the Battery, the salty breeze cool against her face, the sound of waves lapping the stone wall, soothing in its predictability. She spent her afternoons tending her garden, clipping roses, and arranging them into vases that perfumed the house with something sweeter than conflict. She savored the peace Amber's outrage had inadvertently gifted her. Still at night, when she poured herself a glass of sweet tea and sat at her desk, she thought of Daniel. Was he angry? Was he ashamed? Or was he simply waiting for Amber to spin the narrative further before daring to face the truth? 3 days passed. Then 4. On the 5th evening, as the sky over Charleston deepened into a velvet dusk, Pat's landline rang. She answered, expecting Laura, perhaps Harold again. Patricia. Harold's voice came lower than usual, carrying a weight that made her grip the receiver tighter. Yes, she said. There was a pause, the sound of papers shifting on his end, the faint hum of the bank in the background. Then Harold spoke, each word deliberate. You should know Amber filed for divorce. The words struck like a sudden gust off the harbor, rattling the shutters, chilling the room. For a moment Pat said nothing, her reflection staring back at her in the darkened window pane. Amber hadn't just lost the trust. She was burning the marriage too. The knock at Patricia Callahan's townhouse door came just after noon, 3 measured raps that carried no confidence. Pat opened it to find her son standing on the porch, shoulders sagging beneath the August sun. Daniel looked older, worn down, his shirt was untucked, his eyes hollow, and his tie hung limply around his neck like a rope half cut. Mom, he said, his voice gravelly. Can I come in? Pat stepped aside. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort. She simply gestured toward the cool interior, where the faint scent of lemon polish lingered, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence. Daniel lowered himself into a kitchen chair, rubbing his temples as though he'd been holding the world on his back and had finally set it down. She's gone, he muttered. Packed her things last night. Moved out without a word. Pat set a glass of water in front of him. He took it, his hands trembling slightly, and drank. When he finished, he stared at the condensation running down the side of the glass, as though it held the answers. I don't even know when it got this bad, he said finally. One day we were fine. The next he trailed off, shaking his head. Maybe we were never fine. Maybe I just didn't want to see it. Pat leaned against the counter, arms folded. She said nothing. Silence, she'd learned long ago, was sharper than advice when someone was ready to cut themselves open. Daniel's voice dropped. You warned me. I knew she could be difficult, but I thought I thought it was just her being strong-willed. I didn't see everything else. Pat's eyes flickered, but she still didn't answer. She let him sit with his words, let him hear them echo in his own ears. The kitchen filled with the soft clatter of plates as Pat set out lunch, roast chicken, a simple salad, cornbread still warm from the oven. She placed a plate in front of him, another for herself, and they ate in a quiet that felt both heavy and strangely cleansing. The scrape of forks, the creak of wooden chairs, the hum of cicadas outside, all of it formed a rhythm more grounding than conversation could provide. Daniel finally broke the silence. You're not even going to say I told you so, are you? Pat dabbed her lips with a napkin, her eyes steady on him. You already know it, she said simply. A faint, humorless laugh escaped him. He shook his head, leaning back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, as if searching for some pattern in the plaster. I guess I thought losing money would hurt her, but it wouldn't break her. I didn't expect her to just walk away. Pat took a sip of iced tea. Some people value money more than love. You learn that the hard way. Or not at all. Daniel looked at her then, his eyes tired but clearer than they had been in years. For a brief moment, he looked like the boy who used to sail beside his father, squinting against the sun, laughing without weight on his shoulders. That boy was buried deep, but not gone. When the plates were cleared, Daniel stood smoothing his wrinkled shirt. He kissed his mother's cheek softly, a rare gesture, and said, I'll call you soon. Pat watched him leave, the door closing gently behind him. The house fell into silence again, the kind of silence that spoke of endings, but also of beginnings. She carried the dishes to the sink, rinsing them slowly, the cool water washing away more than crumbs. The phone rang, its sharp trill pulling her back to the present. She dried her hands and answered. Patricia? Laura Jennings' voice was crisp, businesslike but touched with warmth. I'd like to invite you as my guest to the Charleston Charity Gala next month. It would be good for you to be seen. And frankly, you deserve it. Pat's lips curved into the faintest smile. Amber had lost her seat at the table. Pat was about to claim her own. The Charleston Charity Gala shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom of the Francis Marion Hotel. Gold light spilled over polished marble floors, and the air buzzed with perfume, laughter, and the faint clink of champagne flutes. Patricia Callahan stood at the entrance with Laura Jennings, her arm looped casually through her attorney's, her presence commanding but understated. Pat had chosen a midnight blue gown, its silk catching the light with every subtle movement. Around her neck hung a simple strand of pearls, her late husband's gift on their 25th anniversary. She hadn't worn them in years. Tonight they felt like armor. Ready? Laura asked softly, her eyes scanning the glittering crowd of Charleston's elite business owners, city council members, non-profit directors, each one circling like planets in a social solar system. Pat's lips curved faintly. Let's begin. They stepped into the current of the evening, greeted by warm handshakes and air kisses. Conversations hummed around them, property developments, school board decisions, harbor renovations, but when Pat was introduced, heads tilted closer, questions sharpened. I heard about the Callahan Scholars Fund, said a man in a tuxedo with salt and pepper hair, the owner of a shipping company. Brilliant idea. Truly, investing in young minds, that's the kind of legacy this city needs. Pat accepted his praise with a nod, her voice smooth. It's about giving opportunity where it matters most. Education can't be bought at a boutique. It has to be earned. The words lingered, a soft blade wrapped in velvet. A few guests exchanged looks, those who knew the whispers, the drama that had swirled weeks before. Pat didn't flinch. Let them wonder. She was the one standing here, pearls gleaming under the chandeliers, calm and untouchable. At one table, she found herself surrounded by women from the junior league. They leaned in, eyes bright, eager to hear more. So the scholarships, one asked, are they only for Charleston students? Pat shook her head. Primarily, yes, but the goal is to expand statewide. My husband believed that hard work should always have a ladder to climb. This fund is the ladder. Hugh applause circled the table, polite but genuine. Yes, someone murmured. Such foresight. Another. What generosity. Pat sipped her champagne, the bubbles crisp against her tongue, and for the first time in months she felt her spine lighten, her breath deepen. Halfway through the evening, Harold Mitchell appeared, his tuxedo pressed but his tie slightly askew, as though he'd come straight from the bank to the ballroom. He clasped Pat's hand warmly. You've done something remarkable, he said. The fund has already drawn attention, and the records we filed? Flawless. No one can touch it. Pat smiled, her grip firm. That's exactly how I like it, he chuckled. You look lighter tonight, like someone who finally got the last number to balance. She tilted her head, pearls catching the light. Perhaps I did. As Harold moved on to greet others, Pat stood for a moment at the edge of the dance floor. The orchestra played softly, violins weaving through the chatter, the faint scent of roses drifting from arrangements placed across the room. She watched couples glide, friends embrace, glasses raised, her own reflection caught in a gilded mirror across the room, not as a woman diminished by age or loss, but as one restored by decision. Laura rejoined her, slipping a fresh glass of champagne into her hand. You're the story tonight, Pat, not the scandal, not the noise, you. Pat let herself smile, truly smile, for the first time since the restaurant slap that had set everything in motion. The weight in her chest eased, replaced by something cleaner, brighter. Then her phone buzzed inside her clutch. She stepped away from the music to glance at the screen. A new message from Daniel. Amber wants to apologize. Pat's fingers tightened on the phone, the glow of the ballroom suddenly dimming around the edges. The doorbell rang just after dusk, its chime echoing through Patricia Callahan's townhouse with an edge that didn't belong. Pat set down her book on the side table and crossed the polished wood floor, her heels clicking softly in the quiet. When she opened the door, Amber stood there flushed, manicured, a too bright smile stretched across her face. In her hand, she clutched a glossy boutique gift bag, tissue paper spilling over the top like confetti. Patricia, Amber said, voice sugar-coated, eyes darting nervously. I wanted to come by. Pat raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside. Come in. Amber crossed the threshold in designer heels that clicked against the old hardwood. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon oil and roses from the vase on the foyer table. Amber glanced at it, then at the chandelier above as if cataloging the house she'd once assumed would be hers. Pat remained standing, posture rigid, hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had no intention of softening the moment with tea or chairs. Amber extended the gift bag with a little flourish, the tissue rustling. Just a little something. Candles, bath salts, thought you might like them. Peace offerings, you know? Pat accepted the bag without looking inside. She set it on the hall table, its presence already irrelevant. Why are you here, Amber? Amber drew in a breath, rehearsed like an actress before a mirror. I came to apologize. I was stressed, emotional, I said things I didn't mean, did things I shouldn't have. I let my temper get the better of me, and I shouldn't have. Her tone was polished, the cadence too even, words strung like beads on a necklace, each carefully chosen, none truly felt. Pat's expression didn't change. Her silence pressed against Amber harder than anger would have. Amber shifted her weight, forcing another smile. I think we just got off on the wrong foot. Families fight, right? But we can move past this. We should. For Daniel's sake. Finally, Pat tilted her head, her voice steady and calm. Your apology is noted. The trust, however, will remain exactly as it is. The words landed like stone. Amber's smile faltered, cracking at the edges. Her eyes flicked away, searching for some opening in Pat's face. Finding none, she adjusted the strap of her purse and nodded briskly. Fine. I understand. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking faster this time. The gift bag rustled behind her like a forgotten afterthought. When the door shut, the house was quiet again, peaceful in its solitude. Pat moved into the kitchen, pulling a glass from the cabinet. The ice clinked sharply as it tumbled into the tumbler, sweet tea flowing over it in a golden stream. She lifted the glass, condensation cool against her palm, and took a long, slow sip. The taste was sharp and sweet, a reminder that not everything needed to be bitter to be strong. She carried the glass to the window, gazing out toward the harbor where the last light of dusk lingered in streaks of lavender and gray. The city outside hummed faintly, distant and small, as though none of its noise could touch her. The phone rang, vibrating against the counter. She set the glass down and answered. Patricia? Harold's voice, warm this time, not weighted. Good news. The Callahan Scholars Fund has already attracted its first round of matching donors. The balance is growing faster than expected. Pat's lips curved slowly, her reflection faint in the darkened glass of the window. Amber had walked away defeated, but Pat's reach was expanding, multiplying. The fund wasn't just secure, it was thriving. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly among the usual stack of bills and glossy catalogs. Patricia Callahan noticed the handwriting immediately, slanted, youthful, uneven in confidence. She carried it to the kitchen, sliced it open with a silver letter opener, and unfolded the lined paper. Dear Mrs. Callahan, it began, thank you for believing in someone like me. I'll be the first in my family to go to college this fall, and your scholarship is the reason. I don't know how to repay you, but I promise I'll work hard enough to make your trust worth it. Pat's eyes lingered on the closing line, with gratitude, Thomas Jenkins, North Charleston High School. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it flat against the table, her fingertips resting there longer than necessary. By week's end, more envelopes followed. Thank you notes scrawled in ballpoint ink, sometimes on notebook paper, sometimes on cards decorated with store-bought flowers. Each letter carried its own story. A girl who dreamed of studying marine biology, a boy determined to become a teacher, another hoping to return to Charleston as a doctor. She read them at her dining table, the morning sun spilling across the mahogany, the faint aroma of coffee filling the air. The words lifted off the page like voices, earnest, hopeful, unpolished but sincere. These were not Amber's kind of purchases. They weren't handbags or weekends away. They were futures, and Pat had bought them gladly. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel knocked on her door. He stood straighter this time, his shirt pressed, his eyes clearer. He carried no baggage, not visible at least. Mom, he said, stepping inside when she gestured. They sat in the parlor, sunlight slanting across the old rug, the faint creak of the ceiling fan circling above. Daniel glanced at the stack of envelopes on the table. What are those? Letters, Pat replied simply. From the first scholarship recipients. He picked one up, running his thumb across the paper, eyes moving slowly over the ink. His expression softened. They wrote to you? They did. For a moment the silence between them was not heavy but shared. He set the letter back down gently. You did something good, Mom. Really good. Pat looked at him, her face unreadable, but her heart unspooling just slightly. It wasn't praise she sought. It was recognition. And in his voice she finally heard it. They ate lunch together, roast chicken sandwiches and sliced apples in the kitchen. Conversation drifted toward old family memories, summers at Folly Beach, his father teaching him how to bait a hook, the year they painted the townhouse shutters blue. They never spoke Amber's name, as though her absence had become natural, like a tide that had gone out and would never return. When Daniel left, Pat carried the letters upstairs. She slipped them into an envelope and sealed it. On the front she wrote Jennings and Associates, for trust records. Later she walked to the corner mailbox, the August air thick with salt, the envelope cool in her hand. She dropped it inside with a decisive clink. The sound echoed faintly, final and permanent. That evening she sat in her study with a glass of sweet tea. She gazed out the window at the harbor, watching sailboats drift lazily, their white sails glowing against the dusky sky. Her chest felt lighter than it had in months, not triumphant, something quieter. Closure maybe, the slap, the purse, the shouting, the silence, each chapter behind her now, sealed away like those letters in Laura's files. The phone rang, its sharp trill breaking the quiet. Pat lifted the receiver. Patricia? Laura Jennings' voice carried warmth this time, a brightness Pat hadn't heard before. I wanted to tell you something directly. The scholarship has become a cornerstone for next year's gala. In fact, the board voted unanimously. They want you to be the guest of honor and the keynote speaker. Pat's hand stilled on the armrest of her chair. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Amber had once believed she would inherit the Callahan name to flaunt. Instead, Pat was being asked to stand beneath chandeliers, not as someone's widow or someone's mother, but as the woman who had turned a trust into a legacy. Guest of honor, Laura repeated. You'll be the one in the spotlight. Pat's lips curved faintly, but her eyes stayed fixed on the harbor, where the last light of day bled into the horizon. Patricia Callahan stood before her mirror, smoothing the front of her black silk gown. The pearls around her neck gleamed under the lamplight, the same ones she'd worn at the last gala, though that night she'd been invisible in the crowd. Tonight she was stepping onto the stage. On the mahogany desk behind her, a single sheet of paper lay folded in half. Her speech. Barely half a page. Precise, deliberate. She had no intention of rambling, no interest in theatrics. It wasn't for Amber, or even for Daniel. It was for the students whose letters still sat sealed in Laura's office, for the futures her pen had preserved. When Laura's car arrived, Pat slid on her gloves, lifted her chin, and walked out with the slow, certain grace of someone stepping into her rightful place. The Francis Marion ballroom was brighter than ever that evening. Chandeliers dripped gold light, violins wove through the hum of conversation, and the air carried the faintest trace of gardenias from towering floral arrangements. Tables glistened with crystal and silver, and the city's most influential faces turned as Patricia entered on Laura's arm. She looks radiant, someone whispered. That's the Callahan woman, another said. The scholarship fund. Pat's lips tightened into a faint smile. Once Amber had craved these whispers, feeding on them like oxygen. Pat hadn't needed them then, and she didn't need them now, but she acknowledged them all the same. When her name was announced and the room's applause swelled, she walked to the podium, heels echoing against the marble floor. The microphone gleamed beneath the lights, and for a moment, the vast room quieted to nothing more than her own heartbeat. She unfolded the page but didn't look at it. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the audience, her voice steady and clear. My husband and I built our lives here in Charleston, with careful hands. We knew the power of numbers, the discipline of saving, the wisdom of investing, not just money but trust. A family trust, some call it. But I have learned in recent months that trust means much more than what can be signed on paper. The crowd leaned in, hushed. It means responsibility. It means respect. And it means choices, sometimes difficult ones. Because the smallest decisions, she paused, letting her eyes scan the faces before her, can protect the largest futures. A ripple moved through the room. Heads nodded. Someone dabbed at their eyes with a linen napkin. Pat's voice never wavered. The Callahan Scholars Fund is not about me. It's not about legacy in the marble and bronze sense. It's about students, bright, determined, often overlooked, who will become the leaders we need. My role is simple. To ensure that what was once guarded as family wealth becomes shared as community strength. She closed her folder gently. And if you take nothing else from me tonight, take this: the investments that matter most are not those that yield interest, but those that yield people. Thank you. For a moment's silence. Then the ballroom erupted in applause, warm, genuine, rising like a tide. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped back as people stood. Patricia inclined her head in a small bow, her smile composed but her chest swelling with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Pride untangled from pain. At a table near the front, Harold Mitchell stood and raised his champagne flute. To Patricia Callahan, he said, voice ringing out, for turning foresight into futures. The room echoed him, dozens of glasses raised in unison. The clink of crystal sang beneath the chandeliers, the sound like light made audible. Pat placed a hand briefly against her pearls, bowing her head in acknowledgement. For all the battles fought in silence, this was a victory she hadn't imagined. As the orchestra swelled and people resumed their chatter, she stepped down from the podium. She was halfway back to her table when a figure slipped into her path, a young woman no more than 19, in a simple dress that looked borrowed for the evening. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her clutch. Mrs. Callahan. Her voice was soft but urgent. I'm one of the scholarship recipients. The fund, it changed my life. The morning after the gala, Charleston glowed in the soft gold of early light. Patricia Callahan walked the waterfront path along the Battery, her low heels tapping against the worn stone, her silk scarf fluttering faintly in the breeze. The harbor stretched wide before her, dotted with sailboats that swayed gently against their moorings, their white sails just beginning to unfurl for the day. The air smelled of salt and pluff mud, the unmistakable scent of Charleston mornings, briny, earthy, alive. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls sharp against the steady hush of waves lapping the seawall. Pat slowed her steps, letting the sound wash over her, steady as a heartbeat. She stopped where the path curved, leaning against the iron railing. Out on the water, a schooner tilted slightly, its sails catching the breeze, its crew moving in practiced rhythm. For a moment she imagined Daniel as a boy again, perched beside his father on their old sailboat, hair whipping in the wind, laughter carrying across the waves. Her husband's absence pressed against her, not painful anymore, but present like the outline left behind, when something cherished has been lifted away. She could almost hear his voice, warm and steady. "You did right, Pat. You kept the balance." She breathed deeply, her chest rising with the harbor air, her shoulders loosening. For once there was no call to brace against, no slap to swallow, no ledger of wrongs demanding tally, just the quiet pull of tide and sky. A green bench waited a few steps ahead. Pat sat smoothing her skirt and folded her hands in her lap. The wind carried the faint scent of fried shrimp drifting from the marina cafe's opening for lunch. Children's laughter rose from a family tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons nearby. Life, simple and unassuming, carried on around her. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out, the screen glowing with Laura Jennings' name. "Patricia," Laura said when she answered, her voice bright. "Just wanted to share some good news. The Callahan Scholars Fund has already grown by 20% since last week. Donations keep pouring in. You've started something bigger than you realize." Pat's eyes flicked to the water, to the sails leaning gracefully against the horizon. "Thank you, Laura. You should be proud," Laura added. "This is a legacy your husband would have been honored to see." Pat ended the call gently, slipping the phone back into her bag. She let her hand linger there, resting against the smooth leather, then withdrew it and clasped it again over her lap. The breeze tugged at her scarf, ruffled her silver hair, cooled the warmth rising in her cheeks. She sat still, absorbing the weight of everything. The battles fought, the trust secured, the future seated, not in handbags or weekend getaways, but in students who had written their thanks in shaky handwriting. For a long moment, she allowed herself the luxury of simply being. No calculations, no signatures, no confrontations, just peace, hard-won, deliberate, hers. A boy on a bicycle whizzed past, laughter trailing behind him. The schooner out on the water tilted again, its sails cutting sharp against the pale morning sky. Pat smiled faintly, her eyes following the horizon. Some investments, she thought, yielded numbers on a ledger. Others yielded silence after storms, laughter after loss, futures after fights. She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirt once more, and began walking back toward her townhouse. The wind followed, carrying the scent of salt and sunlight, wrapping around her like approval. "Some investments pay in dollars," she murmured to herself, her smile widening as she looked toward the harbor. "Others in peace of mind."